Um, First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here. So I want to thank Mike and Maria and everyone that invited us and set up the conference. Um, I wasn't planning on making this next comment, but I am actually blown away by what you have here. So, I come from a very well-established research institution, undergraduate research institution, CU Boulder. But I can tell you, and this might surprise you, we have only a small fraction of the infrastructure and the people and the programs that were just described here. You have every... Oh, that's okay. I've had trouble with connections myself from time to time. But anyway, I didn't plan on... I did not fully appreciate all the resources and talent that you have here, and so I'm very, very impressed, and I think it adds excitement to the whole conversation, as Mike said today. My goal here is to provide some of the foundation for Fernando's presentation and Mike's presentation, and more broadly for some of the discussions that will occur over today and then moving on into the future. And I am a physiologist, as Mike said, which means I'm interested in the function of the body. So, anatomy provides us with that wonderful structure, and then I'm trying to figure out how the body functions and how to keep it functioning well throughout the lifespan. So that's really what we're focused on. And so let's get started, and I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about aging, just to provide that part of the context of the conversation for today. Well, when we talk about aging, we do have a problem. Certainly, as we'll talk about, a great challenge. Many people believe that aging is one of the greatest problems that we face on the scale of global warming. And even the other great challenges that face societies really all over the world, including all of those shown here. On the other hand, aging can be considered a great victory for modern medicine, for public health, for health care itself, allowing people to live long and rich lives. This was not possible just a short time ago in history. And it's even been described as one of the crowning achievements of humanity, what we've been able to do in terms of allowing people to age and live full lives. Whether you look at aging as a challenge, a problem, or a victory, aging is coming. This is one of the terms that's been used, silver tsunami, this wave of older adults that are about to descend upon society and all of the challenges and opportunities that presents. So how did we get to this point in terms of population aging? Well, these images actually describe, in large part, how we got there. Through improvements in public health, like vaccination programs, nutrition programs, improvements in safety and sanitation, of course, modern medicine, which will come up more as we talk today, and then simply improvements in socioeconomic status, access to health care. All of these factors and other factors have come together, and what they've produced is a remarkable increase in life expectancy, shown up here on the top left of this four-panel slide. So in 1900, the average age was 47. Right now, it's in the high 70s and heading upward. This, along with a decline in birth rates and now stable low birth rates, translate on a population level to what we see over here. If we look at the percentage of adults age 65 and over, we've seen this marked progressive increase that is projected to rise well into the middle of this century. And if you take this together with overall population growth, this is the bottom line over here in the lower right-hand corner. These are the absolute numbers of older adults in millions here. In 1900, there were 4 million adults in the United States over the age of 65, 4 million. In 2015, there will be 90 million. There are around almost 50 million now. So this is an incredible change in the aging composition of our population. And this is happening not in all, but in most developing and developed countries throughout the world. So what does this mean? Well, I mean, we're a very diverse audience. We know that it's going to have multiple impacts society-wide, right? One that can be appreciated by most of the folks in this audience is the influence on population health. So if you go back to the beginning of last century, people became ill and died of primarily infectious diseases, but also from malnutrition, accidents, homicides. These were the primary contributors to morbidity and mortality. That's all changed now. So now the majority of our healthcare burden are in what we call chronic diseases, all of the conditions that you see up here that you're so familiar with. And there's only one factor that drives all these chronic conditions. And what is that factor? Aging. Aging is the primary risk factor for all these chronic conditions, and not exclusively, but in large part, these are all chronic disorders of aging. So when you think about that in the context of the kind of growth that we're going to have in our older populations, you can see that these chronic disorders, the prevalence of these disorders are going to continue to increase dramatically over the coming decades. So what kind of health care challenge does this population aging in the U.S. present? This is part of it, and this plays out in all of the chronic diseases that we just talked about. Now, to make matters worse, we're living so long that we're contracting not one of these chronic diseases, but multiple chronic diseases at the same time. And this has been referred to as the comorbidities of aging. So if we take a step back and look at the broad picture here, we have dramatic population aging, and then we have in older adults a high risk of developing these comorbidities. And with that, we can transition to some of the challenges that many of the folks in this room understand and know that we're going to be faced with more and more. Home caregivers are going to be placed in greater and greater burden. Our medical infrastructure, hospitals, nursing homes, long care facilities, personnel, entitlement programs, government entitlement programs like Medicare, the government program that subsidizes health care for older adults. There are going to be dramatic changes to our workforce to retirement balance. And even things like transportation and housing are going to be really dramatically affected by population aging. So we're talking about big picture stuff here, I realize, but just to set the context. So this is important stuff. This is a huge problem. What's the plan? Anything that's going to be this great of a challenge to society, there must be a plan, right? There actually is no plan. No formal plan at all. And what it's been left to academics and policy people, all of us, is to figure out how we can start developing a plan. And research institutions like this are in a great position to contribute to the development of this plan. One of the solutions that's been advanced by people that work in my field, which is biomedical aging research, is to increase Healthspan. And if you work in demographics, population science, like Fernando and others, they've been using the term healthy life expectancy. So he'll recognize that. I'll use the term Healthspan simply because it's the term that's used by my field of study. So let's stop and talk about Healthspan now. First of all, what in the world is Healthspan? Well, we know what lifespan is, right? And we can crudely divide lifespan up into two parts for purposes of discussion. It's oversimplification. There's an initial part of life in which, as the years go by, we are able to retain our health pretty well. We're able to do the things that we still want to do or need to do, perhaps not quite as easily as we could before, right? Many of us are used to this process. And then we enter this period in which we begin to develop these comorbidities of aging that we just talked about. Healthspan, of course, is this period in which we retain pretty good health, good function, good quality of life, independence, prior to moving into this period of chronic disorders. Now, what we've been remarkably successful at doing, which we just talked about, is in extending life. Modern medicine, all the factors that we talked about have helped us extend life. So compared to this profile, we are living longer. That's what we just mentioned. But we're living longer not because we've extended health span, but because we've learned how, through modern medicine and other developments in technology, we've learned to live longer in this period of chronic diseases. That's not a healthy health span profile, is it? In fact, it's an unsustainable profile. If we consider our current health span profile and then this factor, population aging, we're going to be adding more and more older adults to this end of the profile. It is not sustainable. We must be able to figure out how to transition, and obviously it's not going to be immediate, but we need to start engaging in strategies that will start moving us toward this type of health span profile, where we're able to live most of our lives in this healthy state, remain in the health span period, and literally compress the period of chronic disorders, morbidity, into a period at the end of natural life. This is a profile that I've termed optimal longevity. Live long, but live most of your life in a state of wellness. Now, health span is a multi-dimensional concept, as you might appreciate. It is certainly more than often the biomedical presentation of that term, which is, do I have chronic disease? Do I not have chronic disease? And one of the many important dimensions of health span that's underappreciated is physiological function. How we are able to maintain the function of our organs and our integrative overall body function as we age. This is a critical permissive factor in being able to make the transition from our current health span profile to something that we consider more optimal. And therefore, impairments in physiological function that occur as we age are a major impediment to us moving to a more optimal health span profile. Now, at some point, I think most of the people in this room realize that these and other physiological functions will indeed decline with age. This is a bit oversimplified. The slopes are different for the different functions. When the age at which they start to decline, there's tremendous inter-individual and intergroup differences in when they start to decline and the rate of decline. But numerous, hundreds of physiological functions decline and create this integrative decline in whole body physiological function with aging. And this is a major threat to health span. A lot of focus now, of course, on cognitive health and function with advancing age, and we'll come back to this. But it's very important for us to be able to assess and monitor and try to identify ways to maintain function. Our problem then moving forward, other than the simple health and disease paradigm, is we're having declining function with aging and a lot more older adults. So we're facing, in addition to the increases in all those clinical diseases, we're facing a potential perfect storm of physiological dysfunction, activity limitations, disability, frailty. Apart from cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, of course, they're integrated, they're linked, but this is another domain of Healthspan that I wanted to emphasize. So what's the goal? Well, the goal is to optimize both health itself, the absence of disease, and maintain physical and cognitive function as we go through the lifespan. So what does that mean from an illustration standpoint? That means that we need to move from our current rates of decline in function in this health span profile, and we need to change this curve somehow through active engagements in public health and clinical strategies so that we preserve our physiological functions as long as we can. And again, just like the development of clinical disorders, we reserve only the final, very final part of life to undergo significant reductions in these functions. This is the goal, and we're going to need this along with health maintenance itself to be able to achieve a more optimal health span profile. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what are the health span preserving strategies that we can consider? Most of the folks in this room are very familiar with these strategies. I would submit to you, as I will come back to over the remainder of the presentation, that any strategies must be evidence-based. And that's where institutions like UTEP and all of the talent and programs in this room come into play. We need to create evidence-based strategies that promote health span. Healthy lifestyle practices, you could make an argument, have the most evidence at this moment in time for promoting health span. None of this is a surprise to anyone in the room. Physical activity, nutrition, sleep quality, etc. Here we know we all face an adherence issue, right? A compliance issue with guidelines. We also now appreciate maintaining not only physical health, but cognitive health. When you poll folks in the United States, I'm sure it's the same for other countries, people in the middle to older age range, you ask them their number one concern related to health. It's maintaining cognitive function with advancing age. Number one, more than physical function. That's the greatest concern. And of course, we're developing strategies. The research is very much ongoing, how to maintain, in particular, cognitive performance with aging. Preservation of psychological and emotional health, I think, is very critical. And we're starting to understand that positive mood, sense of control, purpose of life, for biologists, you're just reading the words. But I can tell you from someone who has looked at the epidemiological literature on health and physiological function that there is a very, very strong connection. One of the strongest determinants of health span are being able to maintain these properties and sustain those as we go through the aging process. And of course, prevention of disease, which many of the folks in this room are actively engaged in. One of the things that we need to be worried about as we talk about developing strategies to extend health span is the concern about developing health span disparities. So there is a very good possibility that if we're successful in changing that health span profile that we just talked about and lengthening the period of healthy life expectancy, that we're going to do that for about 20% of the population. The people with the highest education and the highest income. One of my colleagues at the Mayo Clinic calls it the guideline followers. Those are the guideline followers, right? Most of us, or all of us. And the 80% of the population won't be able to benefit from the research and education that we provide in terms of health span promoting strategies. And they'll stay in this type of health span profile and undergo those kinds of decline in indicators of health span. So this is something that's very important. Now, one of the new frontiers that I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about while we're still in this health span category is what are some of the new initiatives about how we can study health span, how can we identify strategies that will promote extending health span in the context of the conversations at UTEP today. And one of the new frontiers is to assess circulating biomarkers of health span. So these are biological markers that correlate with other indicators of health span and health span in general. And here we're talking about specifically those that can be assessed and studied in the circulation, for example, in a blood sample. In aging, again, the field that I work in, basic scientists have identified what they call the biological hallmarks of aging. Another term to use is the biological mechanisms of aging. The fundamental mechanisms that occur in our cells, in our tissues, that cause this process that we all see and experience, aging. And we're not going to go through all of these mechanisms, so don't be concerned about that. Although you will recognize a couple: oxidative stress, inflammation. These are basic mechanisms of health and health maintenance. These cellular mechanisms, these fundamental mechanisms of aging, are what determine whether we maintain our physiological function as we age or develop dysfunction. They set us up for either preserving health or developing clinical diseases, and eventually determining our health span. Now, these mechanisms of aging, mechanisms of health span, are influenced and interact with a group of cellular processes, molecular processes, that we could refer to as molecular transducers of health span. So hang in there with me. So these processes that actually Rob and others have talked about in their presentation of the research infrastructure at UTEP are fundamental domains that could be viewed as molecular transducers of health span. Gene variants and expression, processes by which the DNA in genes is altered to influence gene transcription, the RNA transcripts that are produced by gene transcription, proteins that are translated, enzymes, different molecules, biomolecules that are involved in all the chemical processes of the body that produced byproducts that include metabolites, small metabolites. All of these were referred to by Rob and others in terms of the sort of the chemical assessment capabilities of the campus. All of these represent, again, domains of potential biomarkers that we could correlate with health span and gain insight into someone's health span and perhaps health span in the future. So it's these molecular transducers influencing these biological mechanisms that then determine how our function declines and our health decline or not with advancing age to determine our health span. So trying to put all the pieces together now. Let's give you an example, because this is a little bit abstract. Let's talk about metabolomics. So metabolomics is the study of all of the small molecules in a system. Metabolites. Metabolites being the byproduct of the chemical reactions of the body. Now, in aging research, what studies have shown over the last decade or so is if you take the blood from an old mouse and you transfuse that blood into a young mouse, the young mouse takes on at least some characteristics of the old mouse. And the experiments are in reverse, are just the same. So when blood is transfused from a young mouse to an old mouse, there is a reversal or improvement of some of the age-related changes that you see in the old mouse. And these changes are clearly due to some circulating factors in the blood, unknown at this point, but those circulating factors, which could include and likely do include these small metabolites that we're talking about, somehow influence our cognitive function, motor function, including strength, the function of various organs. They influence these major functions of Healthspan, indicators of Healthspan. And so we think metabolites are among those factors circulating in the blood. This is just an example, taking it now to humans and just a work in our laboratory. We've studied thousands of metabolites sampled from the blood in groups of healthy young and healthy older adults. This is what's called a heat map. It's not important, all the details, but it's a colorized representation of the abundance of different metabolites among those thousands that I just mentioned, that you analyze from high throughput metabolomic assessments. And the red means there are higher levels of those metabolites, green, lower abundance. Right? That's just the colorized map. You can see when you look at the plasma metabolome of this group of young adults and that of the older adults, they're different. The abundance of these metabolites are often different in those two groups. We can measure cognitive function, motor function, cardiovascular function, and we can show that there are metabolites who change in abundance from young adulthood to older adulthood, and these folks do not have any disease, that we can correlate with those declines in function. So there are metabolite signatures that change with age that we can directly correlate with declines in physiological function with aging. Or risk factors, changes in cholesterol, for example. All these health indicators we can correlate with these changes in metabolites. Moreover, we can take this group of healthy older adults and we can give them a nutritional intervention, doesn't really matter what it was at this point, and we can show that we can change this plasma metabolome, as we call it, to something that looks much more like that what you've seen in young adults. And lo and behold, it improves their function, and we can identify metabolites that have changed from baseline or before the intervention to after the intervention, and they correlate with the improvements in function. And one final thing, we can look at the metabolite profile in the plasma of these older adults before we intervene, and we can identify dozens that actually predict how much function will improve in response to a certain therapy or intervention. Baseline metabolomic profile predicting function among individuals. And this has obvious implications, as we'll talk about in a second, for personalized or precision medicine. Now, where do these metabolites come from? Well, everywhere. All of the chemical reactions in the body have the ability to move their products into the circulation, and that could then be a circulating biomarker. And I'll just point out one potential source is the gut microbiome, and this was mentioned, I think, in Hector's presentation. You know, the gut is lined with trillions of microorganisms, many of which are bacteria. These are living organisms, so they take the food that we digest and they use that for substrate to create energy. And when they undergo these bioenergetic processes to provide themselves with energy to sustain life, these microorganisms, they produce, guess what? Metabolites. So what happens is that as we age, the gut microbiome remodels. Those trillions of microorganisms, the composition of those microorganisms remodels. And we know very little about the details right now, but we do know that they remodel. And as a consequence, they change the abundance and perhaps even the types of metabolites that are produced. Those metabolites leak through the epithelial barrier of the gut And guess where they end up? In the bloodstream, where they can circulate and access all the cells and tissues and organs of your body and have the ability to influence the function and the health of those tissues. So again, now we've linked, in just one example, how events that are occurring in one area of the body through chemical reaction, the release of metabolites, can affect whole body function. So these are among the potential Healthspan indicators that we're talking about. Now, one of the very interesting and wide open fields that is really perfect for this university and the discussions that we're going to have today is the influence of sociodemographic factors in all of the health and biological connections that we're just discussing. Again, for biologists, this is sort of a black box. We don't think about how these social factors, demographic factors, influence our health and biology. But if you go into the epidemiological, the population literature, there's no question that all these factors and many other factors that aren't represented here play a profound role in how we maintain or don't maintain function or develop disease with aging, and consequently health span and lifespan. Absolutely no question. What do we know? Well, we know that somehow these factors must influence these biological mechanisms that we've already talked about, these hallmarks of aging, fundamental mechanisms of aging. That's how they eventually influence our function and our health to influence our health span. But it's a big question mark as to how this happens. One theory is that these factors are somehow sensed by the brain. And the brain either delivers messages through the nervous system, through the endocrine system, some kind of bloodborne signaling is probably involved in part, and influences gene transcription, protein translation, which then influences these mechanisms, which then influences our health span. Okay? But we really don't know how this works. What we do know, and what we'll be talking about, and Mike will be mentioning, Fernando will be talking about these and other factors, but we know we need to assess these factors. We need to assess circulating biomarkers that might represent some aspect of the biological sequence that's involved, and then we need to be able to assess the function of individuals and their health and disease status, all together in the same study, in the same framework, if we're going to understand how health span is influenced by these factors in a community like here in El Paso and Juarez. Okay. So where are we going with this at the end? I think there are tremendous implications for precision medicine. We could call it precision aging or precision health span, whatever you'd like. We can measure circulating biomarkers perhaps in younger ages or in middle ages and use those to predict who are at greater risk of losing health span as they continue to age, developing disease, having the most severe declines in physiological functions. Perhaps clinically we want to target them for more aggressive intervention, just like we would target someone with a family history of hypercholesterolemia. We'd want to target them at a young age, perhaps with statins or whatever. Same thing here. Which individuals are at risk, or which groups are at risk of more favorable versus less favorable aging? What about treatments? As I mentioned, perhaps we can use these circulating biomarkers of health span to identify individuals who may be more responsive to a certain lifestyle strategy or pharmacological strategy than someone else. So the possibilities are endless. All right, this has been kind of a long section, so I just want to summarize this particular section. Last one short. So we want to improve health span in all populations. That's probably the big picture point. We want to be able to assess and preserve physiological function, so heart function, whole body, motor function, cognitive function. It's going to be very important to assess and relate demographic factors to Healthspan, and also to identify biomarkers and potential predictors of Healthspan in different populations. These are some of the things that we're going to be talking about when Mike presents his framework for just one idea for a project. Now finally, I know some of the folks in the room are interested in education, community health, public health, and I think, as I mentioned before, that research to me, translational research in particular, is an absolute foundation for community health. And let me just give you an example of this. This is how I think about translational research. That we take basic research like that occurs in the College of Science, clinical research that occurs in nursing and the other health science professions. We put that together and we take those observations and we disseminate and we implement those observations in the community. And the goal is to improve public health. I've taken the liberty to change that term to public health span. I think we just made that up. So feel free to use that whenever you want to. But this is how I think about it. And if you go back to the presentations by the deans and associate deans this morning, really you have everything that you need right here to perform translational research with an endpoint of public health span impact in a far greater way than we have at our campus. So it's really remarkable. I think the demand for health span promoting strategies is going to go nowhere but up. This is just the beginning. And that health span demand is going to be driven by some of the factors that we talked about that are related to healthcare challenges that this society faces, but also on a completely different level to our interest, and I'll speak for those of us undergoing the aging process right now. Again, this is what people want, and this is what they're going to demand, and they're going to demand that from their public institutions. What are the answers? What are the strategies? You create and establish evidence-based health span promoting strategies. That's what we're expecting. We want to see that. So there's going to be demand from a number of different quarters of the society. I believe that demand needs to come from institutions such as UTEP. Again, it needs to begin with well-controlled research studies to create evidence-based information that we can then bring in and feed into education and outreach pipelines. And this is going to be a big tent issue. Someone from the College of Liberal Arts made the comment, you need everyone to be involved in this if you're going to really answer big questions. This is just another version of big science. But it's highly interdisciplinary, and it's going to require all the folks in here and others from campus to really make the most impactful advances. So here's my thought process. This is how I view the coupling between research, education, and outreach. We begin really outreach, we create outreach rather, by funneling it through the portal of evidence-based research. And we provide information, education, health assessments. All of our activities are evidence-based, and that's the information that we move into the community with implementation, dissemination, public health-based activities and strategies to promote Healthspan. This is the sequence of events in my mind, or at least one model to do that. This is something we've been trying to do. So we're an NIH-funded translational research lab conducting healthy aging research. So in our off hours, we've tried to, walk the walk instead of just talking the talk. So we've created a healthy aging project where we tried to practice what we preach in terms of this interaction between research and community engagement and outreach on public health. So here's I'll show you the website in a second, but this is the front page of the website. And now I'm going to do something that will probably screw everything up, but I'm going to try to take you live onto the website. Okay, I do accept. I thought I was already logged in, but we'll see. Oh, do I? I didn't mean for this to be a big delay. We were logged in. Oh, does it? Okay. Okay. Anyway, actually we don't need it. So we don't need to do this. But the website, I would encourage you to go to the website. Something's a little difficult to do here. And it's simply called the Healthy Aging Project. So it's really easy, the Healthy Aging Project. Just Google it, go into it, and you can see we have all kinds of information on healthy aging, and all of this has been vetted by myself or my postdocs or our colleagues or our students. And this is sort of what I'm talking about. All of the information that you'll see on this website, and you can go under all of these categories and they'll bring up their own, sort of sub-websites. And all of this is evidence-based information from research that we've personally vetted. And this is available for the community. All right. And this is a slide just for me to emphasize the reason why we've done this in part is because there are a lot of snake oil salesmen out there, as you know. And so we really have to be careful and make sure the community that demands this information wants the information, has access to the proper kind of information. Okay. So as a wrap-up, this is our current Healthspan profile. I think UTEP and other research universities throughout the country are in a unique position to create the science, the translational research, and the education and outreach activities to move us to a more favorable Healthspan profile. And ultimately, I think Spock had it right. Live long and prosper. And we want all groups, all peoples, to be able to live long and prosper. And so I just want to thank you very much and appreciate your attention.